All right, everyone, welcome to the final session of Maine 2024, the Thursday afternoon, before, I guess, the educational day tomorrow. Yeah, that happens, right? So to kick us off, I'm pleased to introduce Alexander Meulmans, who is joining us from Switzerland. So after completing his PhD at ETH Zurich, he stayed around Zurich and got his current position at Google Research as a research scientist. And as I'm sure you heard from the talk, he's interested in this intersection of computational theoretical neuroscience and machine learning, in particular with like in-context learning and reinforcement learning. And I'm excited to hear what you're going to tell us about today. So thanks.
All right. Very excited to be here today. Thanks to the organizers also for inviting me. So in my PhD, I was actually quite involved in the neuro-AI field, like bit more with biologically plausible learning rules and so on. But then towards the end of my PhD and now also at Google, I'm actually focusing more and more on reinforcement learning and multi-agent reinforcement learning. So today I will talk a bit about our recent work on multi-agent reinforcement learning, which was in close collaboration with all these amazing folks there on the slide. So if you're interested in it, there are also a couple of the authors actually sitting here in the audience, so for sure go also talk to them. But without further ado, let's jump into it. So maybe first, why should you actually be interested in multi-agent RL? And we are a social species. Like much of what, at the core of what makes us human is how we interact with each other, how we model each other, and also how we model ourselves. And how we are using AI today, and also in the future, is going to reflect more and more that we're actually a social multi-agent species. And it has actually quite a huge potential because, as we all know from doing science projects, if you actually collaborate with more people, their output of the project is often also of much higher quality. So if we just imagine both interacting with AIs or just AIs interacting with each other, if they actually can efficiently collaborate, reasoning together, brainstorming together, the outputs that we're going to get out of the systems are going to be much, much better. And on the other hand, it was already mentioned the last days, there is this sort of problem of a data wall that we're running out of text tokens on the internet, so there's an active search towards more open-ended environments that we actually can self-generate more and more interesting data. And for this type of applications, multi-agent RL is again very natural, because if your environment contains other agents that are also learning and getting better and better, your task actually gets harder and harder and more interesting and more interesting. But there are some challenges which actually is preventing us from sort of harvesting the full potential of this multi-agent setup. Mainly that actually our current multi-agent training methods are really not sufficient to get to these ideal situations of good, efficient collaboration, brainstorming, all these things. And there is also really a limited understanding of which sort of training dynamics leads to which type of solutions that we get. And because probably a lot of the audience are not very familiar with multi-agent RL, I'll just guide you a bit through the basics. So one of the first differences between multi-agent RL and normal reinforcement learning or just deep learning and so on in general is that actually the problem that you're considering, the environment, is non-stationary because your environment contains other agents that are also learning. And like a useful concept from game theory is like a Nash equilibrium. And what it basically says is, when is this environment actually going to be stationary? And well, that is if like all the agents have actually a policy which is a best response against the current other policies of the agents there. But interestingly, in many problems of like decent complexity, you actually have infinite amount of Nash equilibria. And what I want to stress here, like multi-agent RL is not your kind of average beast in deep learning, where you try to optimize an objective and like your enemies are noisy gradients, a local maxima or something that sort of prevents you to efficiently get there. Like a multi-agent system, each agent is really optimizing its own objective, but depends on also the other agents. So it's just a very complex dynamical system. It's not a joint optimization of like a single objective, and it can really just converge to arbitrary equilibria, which can be arbitrarily bad for all the agents involved. And to just illustrate this a bit, we can look at the canonical iterated prisoner's dilemma. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the prisoner's dilemma. Is basically you have two prisoners, they're being interrogated, and they can either remain silent, so cooperate with each other, of not ratting the other one out, or they can confess and thereby reduce their prison sentence to stay less long in prison. And if they both remain silent, they only have to serve 1 year in prison, but if they both actually confess, then they actually need to remain 5 years in prison. So the social dilemma in here is a bit that from just a selfish perspective, regardless of the action of the other guy, it's always better to confess, like to defect, because you will strictly decrease your prison sentence. However, if both defect, like it's a strictly worse outcome than if both cooperate. The interesting thing is when you play this game many times, then all of a sudden you do have Nash equilibria which actually are cooperating and so on. And so a famous one is like the tit-for-tat strategy, where you basically just repeat the action that the other guy did the previous time step. So if you defect, then I will also defect in the next time step to punish you, but if you cooperate, then I will also cooperate in the next time step to reward you. And both are positive in the beginning, so they both start like cooperating with each other. So this is one Nash equilibrium, but as I told you, you have arbitrarily many Nash equilibria. So another one is, for example, unconditional defection. Like if the other guy is unconditionally defecting, the best thing you can do is also just always defecting. There is nothing you can do to sort of teach him good manners. And thing is that tit-for-tat equilibrium is strictly better than the unconditional defection for all agents involved. However, if you would just in practice do gradient-based descent on each objective of the agent, then actually for almost all configurations, you'll just converge to mutual defection. So there is quite a need for better training methods, and even just conceptually, like, do we need to do gradient descent? Do we need to include other things in there? There's a lot of stuff to figure out, so it's a very exciting place to be in at the moment. But you might think, okay, you told me that the iterated prisoner's dilemma is a very difficult and normal methods fail on it, but we also see in the news like these amazing results of AlphaGo, of AlphaStar, and also the OpenAI equivalents and so on. There is really being done a lot of cool stuff in multi-agent RL. The problem there is that they all consider like some special cases of multi-agent RL, where either you have pure competition, so it's a zero-sum game, like playing chess, either you win or the other guy wins, you cannot both win. Or like it's like a pure collaborative setting where all the agents actually have exactly the same reward function, and then it's basically like a distributed learning problem, but still it's all optimizing one joint objective. But the most general case is like the general sum game, where you have like a mix of cooperation and competitiveness, and that's in there. And I would argue that this is basically all the settings that we have in daily interactions with each other. All of us have a bit their own objectives, but to actually achieve our own objectives, we should both collaborate with each other, but also be sometimes a bit competitive. And maybe before diving into some of our new ideas on actually how to approach this, let's take first a look at why actually just doing RL for each agent separately leads to bad outcomes. And so if you just consider like a normal RL learning trajectory where the RL agent just sees like a batch of episodes, it uses these episodes to do a parameter update and so on and so forth. The RL policy gradient assumes that your environment is stationary, meaning like if you're the only source of change in the whole problem. If you update your parameters, you can consider that everything else remains the same. But as we discussed before, multi-agent RL is non-stationary. The agents in the environment are going to adapt their behavior on your behavior. And so what the problem is that in a RL update, you don't have this feedback that actually your behavior affects the future behavior of the other guy. Meaning that, for example, in iterated prisoner's dilemma, you naively think you can get away with defecting because anyway you think the other guy will not change his policy. And also you don't have any incentive at all to teach him good manners by rewarding when he cooperates or punishing him when he defects. And that you can combine with that actually at initialization, if you just randomly initialize the weights of a network, it's often very unstructured. And against an unstructured policy, it's almost always better to just quickly defect, if you consider that the other guy is going to remain stationary. And this really leads to some vicious cycle of both parties going to defect more and more and more. And so if you look a bit at nature, because we humans obviously can cooperate with each other and negotiate these trade-offs between competitiveness and cooperativeness, so we might look a bit there for some inspiration. And on the one hand, we are not purely selfish. We also care a bit about each other, about the welfare of the other persons we are interacting with. And in RL terms, you can translate this to reward shaping. You not only give the agent the reward of its own objective, but for example, you also give it a tiny bit of the reward of the other guy, such that it actually starts caring about the other guy. And this works great. Like there is a team at DeepMind of Libo who did a lot of great work on this, where you can reach cooperation and so on, but sort of the Achilles heel is that you need to assume that everyone is actually using pro-social rewards. If you now put like a purely selfish agent in it, it's quite easy for that agent to start exploiting the other guys because they're pro-social. The other direction that we can do is look a bit at how we actually experience life. We don't experience life as in conventional RL, where we cut all our experiences in separate episodes, and we use these episodes to then update our parameters, and afterwards we just completely forget about it. We actually observe very long trajectories where we observe other guys learning as well. So we're actually aware of the learning of the other agents in the environment. We know that they adapt their behavior to our behavior. And this is, I think, one of the most exciting and promising directions currently now in the field. But we actually are not sure on why this works and when this works and how it works. So that's actually what we're going to discuss a bit today. So first, I'm going to introduce like a new method that we came up with of just some efficient policy gradient to incorporate this learning awareness. And then I think the most interesting part will be how this actually leads to cooperation. And then in the end, as we're doing science, we also need to show you that it actually works. So I'll show you some empirical results. And maybe first, before diving into the method, let's take a step back and discuss a bit what we actually want to get out of a new reinforcement learning method. And if you actually want it to have impact, it should be quite compatible with models at scale. So like now with the big sequence models and so on. And so one of the main lessons there, I could have put like a shrine picture of Sutton's bitter lesson there, but I'll just call it keep it simple. Meaning that we don't want to have like these complicated higher order derivatives, complicated meta-learning setups and so on. And it should just be compatible with the actual advances made in single agent RL. Like if PPO works great, we should actually be able to also use PPO or your other favorite RL algorithm in our setting. And then finally, this is a point that is up for discussion. Probably some in the room will not agree with it. I would also argue that actually decentralized training is quite important, just that it's very compatible with all the infrastructure that we have now, but also actually to understand quite important phenomena arising in multi-agent systems. If you're interested in that, we can discuss it later. It should not only be compatible with sequence models, it should also really leverage this powerful sequence models that we have now. And what they're particularly good at is this in-context learning or in-context inference capabilities, and also nowadays they can handle really, really long context. So we can really sort of leverage that and make use of that. All right, but so let's turn to actually the question, how can we incorporate learning awareness? And sort of the most obvious thing you can do is you just observe multiple episodes of another agent, and in between each episode, the other agent actually updates its parameters. And for this setting to sort of make sense, we actually need to have some sort of an asymmetric setting where we have, on the one hand, just naive reinforcement learners, which are just doing the thing that I told you before. They play your favorite board game, for example. They use the experience to update their parameters, and they're going to play a new board game against you. But then on the other hand, you actually have a meta-learning agent that is now not only going to observe the single episodes, but it's actually going to observe the whole concatenated trajectory of like different episodes of the board games that you're playing. And how you can think of it is, the meta agent is gonna see a lot of these meta trajectories, and for each meta trajectory, you're gonna initialize a new naive learning agent. You're gonna play many board games against it, observe the whole learning trajectory, then do a meta update, and then draw like a new naive learner. And you're actually gonna train your meta agent on the accumulated reward of the whole learning trajectory. So what it's actually gonna try to do is to shape the behavior of the naive learner towards good settings where it's actually collaborating and so on, such that you, from a selfish perspective, can actually get quite high rewards. And so if you take a closer look at the policies that they're now using, they both a meta and a naive learner are just using a sequence model. You can even give exactly the same architecture. The only difference that's gonna be is that the naive learner is only gonna see in context the current inner episode and is gonna update its parameters after each episode, whereas the meta agent is gonna observe in context the whole learning trajectory so far and is only gonna update its parameters after a full meta trajectory. All right, and so then if you look at what actually this meta policy or sequence model needs to do, on the one hand, it needs to infer in context implicitly the parameters or the current policy of the other agents such that it can adapt to it. And then it actually needs to simulate like a new policy for the current episode that both is a very good response against the current policy of the other guy, but also can really shape it towards better behavior in the future. Again, teaching it a bit good manners, rewarding cooperation, punishing defection. All right, and so one detail that I left out here is that actually in RL we never use a single episode to update our policy because RL is very, very noisy. We actually need a whole batch of episodes to do a parameter update. And you can formalize this with actually, we call it a batched co-player shaping POMDP. Very long name, but what it's actually doing is we're now just gonna consider simulating like B learning trajectories in parallel. And so each of these learning trajectories just you play as a meta agent against a naive agent. The only way in which these parallel trajectories are coupled is at each inner episode boundary. Now the naive learner is gonna combine the experience of the whole batch to do its parameter updates, and then the new policy is gonna play the next batch there. And from the meta agent's perspective, this is now really just a single agent problem because your environment contains like naive agents drawn from some initial distribution and which actually learn with a fixed learning algorithm. So now we're again like in our sweet spot of we have a single objective to optimize and we can apply our favorite policy gradient algorithm or other reinforcement learning algorithm on it to optimize it. And so this is how we get our, we call it co-agent learning aware policy gradient, mainly because it has like a funny abbreviation. And if you look at the actual policy gradient that comes out of it, the main sort of nuance or difference with just applying naively policy gradient updates to like a single trajectory is that now to update like the action probability of a single action, you're not just gonna regard the accumulated reward of this specific trajectory, but they're actually gonna average it over the whole batch in the future. And why is this? Is because that your action actually influences the update of the parameters of the other guy, and then the updated parameters of the other guy influence all the future trajectories in the batch. But if you just do this trick, then everything works out. You can use your favorite RL method. And quite importantly, previously, like previous methods in the field actually made like some slight mistakes in this actually, resulting in policy gradients that didn't really work well and really pushing them towards evolutionary search algorithms and so on. And so now with this policy gradient, we fix this, at least in our experiments. It's still up for scaling it up and so on. All right, but now let's go to the bit more interesting question of how this can actually lead to cooperation. Because before we sort of saw this asymmetric setting where we have a very capable meta agent that has sort of privileged information of seeing full learning trajectories of the other. But what we're actually interested in is, okay, if we now have equally capable agents, let's say all of them are like these meta agents, how can we actually achieve cooperation in such a setting? And we're gonna investigate this with a simple example, the iterated prisoner dilemma. Now I just visualize there the actual rewards that we're using in the problem. And we're not going to use reinforcement learning for now. We're actually going to analytically compute like the discounted average reward for each agent, which you can do, and then you can just use your favorite automatic differentiation package to sort of backpropagate through it and really use the ground truth policy gradients and not reinforcement learning ones. We use checks, you can use whatever you want. And then the first sort of observation that we make, if we consider this asymmetric setting, so like a meta agent against like a weaker naive learner, then the meta agent is gonna extort the naive learner. And what do I mean by this? Imagine you have the tit for tat policy, which would be like a fair cooperation policy. You teach the other guy good manners by cooperating if he cooperated previously or defecting if he defected previously. But what you actually also can do is you're still going to reward him a little bit, but actually not too much. So if the other guy cooperated before, you're going to cooperate with, let's say, 60%. If he defected, you're going to defect for sure. And so then like, it still is in the benefit of the naive learner to just purely cooperate, but you're actually going to get most of the rewards out of this. But the nice thing is that actually if you initialize your meta agent with pure defection, which we did in here in the plot, your shaping gradients are actually still going to push it out of this pure defection because it pays off more for the agent to sort of extort the other guy instead of just doing unconditional defection. So now in this setup, unconditional defection is not anymore an equilibrium, which is very important because this was sort of hurting multi-agent systems before. But then, if you now, let's consider a situation that you train two meta agents against like naive agents, so the meta agent never train against each other, but then you're just going to evaluate from time to time how the two meta agents are playing against each other. Then actually both meta agents are going to try to extort the other one, but now the other one is not a naive learner, so it actually is not working out, which actually leads to just mutual defection again. And so this would be the red line that you see there. I think the pointer is not working, so you'll just have to guide your eyes yourself. But so the blue line would be the performance against a naive learner, so you see you efficiently extort them, but then actually if you play against a meta agent, then you start mutually defection. But then what we can do is now we're actually going to start training both meta agents against each other. So both meta agents have already like an extortion policy now, but now we're actually gonna start putting them against each other. And what's happening now is each agent is trying to extort the other one, and with extortion, it really means it's sort of gonna shape the gradient of the other one towards more cooperation. But the nice thing is now they're both doing it with each other, so they're actually gonna both push the other guy towards more and more cooperation. And as you see in here, if you follow now the red line, which is again meta versus meta, it actually nicely converges to just cooperation, and in practice it's like a tit for tat policy that comes out of it. So then what we actually can do now is combine these two insights into some multi-agent training setup that actually quite robustly leads to cooperation. And how we're going to do that is actually to consider like a pool setting. So you still, let's say, have a two-player multi-agent game, but now you're actually going to have a larger pool of agents, and sometimes you're going to play against one of the agents, other times you're going to play against another one. And so then if you now, as a meta agent, you both play against other meta agents, but also sometimes against naive agents, you're on the one hand going to have these shaping gradients that push you away from defection towards extortion, but on the other hand, you're going to have like the self-play or other play gradients against other meta agents that are actually pushing you away from extortion towards cooperation. And then as you see on the left, this combines, pushes you just to cooperation. If you then, on the other hand, would just consider a pool of only meta agents, so only equally capable agents, then you're missing this first ingredient of like a gradient that pushes you away from defection, so you're actually gonna converge to mutual defection. All right, but so then to finish, I also need to show you, of course, that it actually works with a reinforcement learning method that we actually showed you in the beginning. So for this, first we again just consider the iterated prisoner's dilemma, a bit different from the conventional approach in the field that would just use like a tabular policy. We actually use like already respectable Hawk network, so like these linear recurrent units, these modern RNNs basically. And so again, like it's basically the same architecture for both meta agent, naive agents, but the only difference is like which context they can look at and on which rewards and so on they're trained at. And so then, maybe to explain you the baselines, if you remember the slide that I used before, if you look at the right of the slide, our method sort of prescribes that you should average the returns over the whole batch in the future. Like a simple control that we can do is just say only consider the return of the current parallel trajectory, not of the whole batch. And then you also have this MFOS baseline, which is actually sort of the state-of-the-art other method in the field in this space, which almost uses like this policy gradient, but doesn't really principle derive it and made some mistakes in how to scale your current episode return against the next episode return. And actually we see that if you now apply it on these more bigger like recurrent neural networks, it actually fails to reach a decent shaping of the other guy. So basically, yeah, you see on the left plot just the performance that we're actually efficiently extorting the poor naive learners. And then, interestingly, if you're actually going to look at one of such meta trajectories at the end of training, so now in the middle plot you actually see the learning trajectory of like a naive agent against like a fully trained meta learner. Already then you see that in the beginning, on the blue lines, you see actually that the meta agent is going to do a bit like tit for tat-ish style of sort of shaping the other guy to cooperate. But then during half of training, it's actually going to leverage the fact that reinforcement learning or gradient updates are a bit slow to catch up. So it's just going to start purely defecting, and the other guy is just slow in catching up of also starting to defect. Whereas for the other baselines, they just converge to pure defection. And then if you now consider like the mixed group setting, so really putting equally capable agents against each other, they're actually starting to cooperate, which is pretty neat. All right, and so of course the iterated prisoners dilemma is very, very toyish. We're going to remain toyish, but a little bit less toyish in this cleanup environment. And so we basically just implemented a very efficient, low-dimensional version of like a sort of Atari-type environment that is being used in the multi-agent field. And what it is actually considering is you have like an apple orchard on the right, and you have like a polluted river on the left, and you can either move left, go cleaning the river a bit, or you can go move right and start harvesting apples. The thing is that the rate at which apples spawn there in the orchard depends on how polluted the river is. And if the river is too polluted, there is no apples whatsoever that are being grown. The last special thing is actually that agents also can zap each other. So if you find that the other agent is really unfair, you can zap him, and he's going to have a timeout of 5 time steps that he actually cannot do anything. And so you actually see that this is sort of a mix of like a tragedy of the commons and free riders on the one hand, because if both start like only harvesting apples, like the river gets too polluted and everyone loses. But on the other hand, the zapping starts introducing like some sort of a prisoner's dilemma in there, meaning like if both agents are zapping each other, like defecting, they have both less time to actually harvest apples. If they're both not harvesting, not zapping each other, they can both harvest apples. But if one zaps the other and the other one doesn't zap back, then there's a time out of one agent, and actually the other agent can just harvest all the apples. So there's always sort of this incentive there as well. And so then if you now consider again the shaping setting of a meta agent against naive agents, you see that compared to baselines, we get actually much, much higher returns. And also if you really look at the behavior, I guess the plots are a bit too complicated to go into, but just believe me, what we actually end up with is we're actually also sometimes going to clean the river a bit to sort of incentivize the other guy, reward him for cooperative behavior, and we're actually going to zap each other way less than for the other baseline methods. If you now again consider the sort of mixed group settings where you play both against other meta agents, other naive learners, then we're actually also going to reach these cooperative solutions where both of us are actually going to switch with cleaning the river, harvesting apples, and we're not going to zap each other, in contrast to like other standard reinforcement learnings, which just converge to much more zapping. All right. So then maybe just as a conclusion, I think the main takeaways you should take from here is that if you want to reach cooperation from this learning awareness, there are actually two important ingredients. On the one hand, you need to observe that your behavior affects the future behavior of the other guy, meaning that you actually can shape them towards more cooperative environments, behavior, even extortive behavior. But on the other hand, you sort of should avoid that you just both converge to trying to extort the other guy, like really just trying to manipulate the other agents. So you should also actually play against agents that are sort of immune to being shaped on a very fast time scale. And one setting that makes this possible is this sort of mixed group setting that we introduce in here. So here you have like a mix between these learning aware far-sighted agents and then sort of short-sighted agents that greedily maximize just their inner episode returns. And just a bit to emphasize these sort of short-sighted agents, either they can really be in the environment, or like if you have a model of other agents in your head, you sort of can just play your model on a faster time scale and really observe updates of the agent that you're modeling. And maybe also if you're familiar with other shaping methods like Lola, and there are a bunch of them, we actually in our paper also sort of reinterpret or revisit them through the lens of these hypotheses and really explain why they reach cooperation. And so, the question now is how general are these insights? As a disclaimer, we only tested it on like this iterated prisoner's dilemma and a bit more complicated but still very toyish grid world. And we think the arguments are pretty general, and we're very excited to continue exploring it. But I think, one of our main tasks is actually now to start scaling it up and actually observe whether it really can solve these problems. I showed you this slide before of what should a solution look like. I think we did a good job in keeping it simple and leverage really the powerful sequence models. One thing I left out, but which is also very, very important, is actually to train big sequence models, we should have very good learning signals. And for there, the self-supervised prediction is an actual must. And so for this, we're also now really excited to go into the model-based ORL. So with this, if you're interested in the paper, Google it. Hopefully you'll find it. I think we uploaded an updated version today, so should be available tomorrow. And then, only thing left for me is to thank all these amazing persons on the slide. And of course also you for your interest in our work. Thanks a lot.
That's great, thank you. In the interest of not getting too much further behind time, we can take one quick question while our next speaker sets up, if we have one.
Thanks very much for the great talk. You mentioned that very briefly that it seemed like defect effect is in your setup is no longer a Nash or no longer a stable equilibrium of that setup. Can you say something about like what Nash equilibria are left over? Like how do you know that this pro-social equilibrium are untouched?
It's a very good point, and to be short, I didn't properly investigate it yet. I think it's also a bit of, you now have this mixed setting that you play against multiple agents, so it's sort of, like now the Nash equilibria should be like some sort of a group Nash equilibria that you have a best policy against all the agents in the group, and then it also depends a lot on whether, for example, a tabular policy, then you really cannot infer to which agent you're playing against. You cannot do any in-context inference. So then sort of you also need to have one single policy that applies to to all the agents in the group. Whereas if you have a big sequence model, you sort of can infer from context a bit whether you're playing against a naive one or not. And so then you can sort of distinguish it, and then you have, again, like a different sort of Nash equilibrium type. So there are a lot of interesting questions, I think, to investigate here.
Right, thanks. All right, so well, we get the microphone working. I'll introduce our next speaker. So we're pleased to have Keyvan Dai, who's visiting us from Seattle, currently a senior scientist at the Allen Institute for Neurodynamics. As we've heard, Seattle is the place for neurodynamics. That is definitely the thread from today. After Montreal, sorry, I didn't mean to belittle this, this place that I am completely unbiased about. So before being in Seattle, Keyvan did his PhD at Cornell studying zebrafish ocular motor responses, and then postdoc at the Genelia Research Campus looking at short-term working memory. And these are some that's a thread that continues in his present work, which I'm sure we'll hear about today, looking at how these things impact learning, I believe. So take away, thanks.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah? Cool, yeah. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me. It's been a really great meeting. So today I want to tell you about some work that we're doing at the Allen Institute. Not advancing. All right, sorry for that. It's a collaboration between many of us at the Allen Institute for Neurodynamics and our colleagues at Google DeepMind. We have a shared interest in identifying the learning rules in the brain, and these are the rules that govern how synapses change, which synapses change and by how much, and we can write down some general form of an equation. This is our delta Wij, that's a key parameter. It's how much does the weight change, connecting neuron I to neuron J. And that should depend on many state variables in the brain. For example, presynaptic activity in neuron J, postsynaptic activity, the reward, the existing connections, the motivational state of the mouse or the monkey or the subject, and a host of other features. And so there's many possible solutions to this problem. Many models have been proposed for different purposes, for explaining how learning works in the brain, for practical uses, for training machine learning networks. And these models all kind of have been sitting on the shelf as potential hypotheses about how learning could work in the brain. But there's actually very little data at the moment to constrain these models. And so we wanted to start to make progress on this question. And the main reason we don't have data to constrain these is because there's basically two important reasons. One is the complexity of neural circuits, and the other is the difficulty with measuring changes in connectivity across the brain. So I want to go into those two in a bit more detail. First, for the complexity. When we're learning some new task, fundamentally what we need to do is form new links between incoming sensory inputs and the appropriate behavioral outputs. Like when we're learning the piano, we have these new streams of information coming in, the notes on the page, the feeling of the keys on our fingers, the sound of the keys. And we need to learn to execute the right movements, push the right keys when we see the specific note printed on the page. Now, perceiving these sensory stimuli and executing these movements involve distributed circuits across the brain with millions of neurons potentially overlapping between each other and potentially billions of synapses. And so when we're trying to fit some model, there's just a huge number of parameters here. And so what we have done and what many before us have done to try to simplify the complexity of this control problem is just use a brain-computer interface. And there's many potential brain-computer interface solutions that you can come up with. One example here is very nicely illustrated on this Sattler et al. Paper, where a monkey is controlling the position of a cursor on a screen. So the monkey's instructed to move the cursor to this position. Now there's some mapping between the activity of the neurons being recorded in the brain and the position of the cursor, and so the monkey's job is to figure out what pattern of activity it needs to generate in order to move the cursor in the right place. And so over time, the monkey has to start to produce new patterns of activity, much like it would do when it's learning some new movement. And so we think that the processes underlying the acquisition of BCI control are very similar, if not the same, to the processes underlying learning of naturalistic behaviors, because in that case, the monkey also has to generate new patterns of activity. The nice thing, though, is that in this configuration, we have direct access to the neurons that are involved in the task, right? We choose who the neurons are, and so those are the neurons that should be changing. And so if we study the circuitry surrounding those neurons, we should be able to learn something about the learning rules. But then there's still that second challenge of measuring the changes in connectivity. Now, the gold standard method for measuring connections in the brain, of course, is electron microscopy, and you can do that after you've characterized the neurons, but you're limited there to one point in time, right, after you've sacrificed the animal. But delta implies, of course, at least 2 time points, and so we want to be able to measure the connections, say, before and after learning. To do that, we've turned to two-photon optogenetics. This approach allows us to both characterize the activity of neurons, potentially in large populations, thousands of neurons at a time, but also to manipulate the neuron's activity with single-cell resolution. So just in a cartoon version of this, we'll activate a specific cell while we're simultaneously looking at the activity of the rest of the network. And so if some other neuron lights up, we can infer that there's some connection. We call it a causal connection from the stimulated neuron onto the non-stimulated neuron. We're careful to call it a causal connection because there's one important limitation of calcium imaging, which is the temporal resolution. It's such that we can't tell if it's a direct monosynaptic connection or some polysynaptic connection, but importantly, it depends on synaptic connections in the network. And so if there's some plasticity changing these connections, then we should be able to pick that up in these kinds of measurements. So this is the outline of the talk. First, I'll introduce to you our BCI task and kind of introduce some of the results and analyses and what the implications are for the learning rules. And then I'll show you our two-photon connection mapping paradigm, what the experiment looks like, how we analyze the data. And this isn't really a separate part of the talk. This is more mixed throughout these 2 parts, but importantly, we want to do network modeling so that we have some intuition about what our data should look like and how we analyze it, so that ultimately we can try to distinguish between different models. This is the model that I'll focus on throughout. This is a 3-factor Hebbian learning rule. It turns out that this model does a very good job explaining a lot of our data. So that's kind of what I'm going to walk you through and hopefully convince you that something like that is probably happening in the brain. So first, the brain-machine interface. We picked basically the simplest sort of mapping from activity to behavior. Here we're recording activity again, as I mentioned, using two-photon calcium imaging, and we're picking a single neuron. This is in the forepaw motor cortex in layer 2-3. It's an excitatory neuron, and that neuron's coupled to a motorized reward port. Every time the neuron becomes active, the reward port gets closer to the mouse. So the mouse wants to get water, and so in order to do that more frequently, it should increase the activity of that neuron. So there's a few trials shown here. This is the activity of the conditioned neuron. And these first 2 trials plotted here, the activity is relatively modest, and therefore the movements of the lick port are modest. And this is kind of the threshold position where the mouse is allowed to lick to harvest a drop of water. And we have a 10-second trial period. And on these 2 trials, the mouse failed to move the lick port close enough, and so those were missed trials. The mouse didn't get water. But on these subsequent trials, you can see there's large activations of this neuron, and therefore fast movements of the lick port. In fact, the speed of the lick port is proportional to the amplitude of the transient. So the mouse is really motivated to really drive the activity of this neuron. This is what it looks like in action. Here's a zoom in of our two-photon field of view. I've highlighted the conditioned neuron in red here, and here's our mouse with the lick port. You can see there's this plastic tube here attached to the assembly so that the mouse can continuously monitor how far away the lick port is with its whiskers. And we think that that kind of feedback is really important so the mouse knows at all time points how well it's doing on the task. So I'll play this movie here. Whenever the neuron lights up, the lick port gets closer. We then wait for it to drop its activity back down to some threshold before initiating the next trial. And so now the activity has to go back up for the mouse to get some water. And it does, and so the mouse gets water. And so really, when the mouse has solved this task ideally, what we expect to see is that the activity of this neuron starts to go up quickly at the start of every trial, right? The optimal solution, in a sense, to this is just maximizing the activity right at the start of the trial so the mouse can optimize its reward rate. And this is kind of in the middle of a training session, and so you start to see trials that look like that, where the activity is very high right at the beginning of the trial. And we can kind of fast forward through. So here later on, we see lots of activity closely aligned with the start of the trial. And so what we say is that this neuron has become tuned to the trial start. So if we take the average across all of our trials, we see that this neuron is reliably activated within the first few seconds of the start of the trial. And so again, we say that this has become tuned. But of course, we've just picked this neuron at random from a population of hundreds of thousands of neurons in motor cortex. So how would the mouse know? Well, in the beginning, it doesn't know, and the neuron is kind of irregularly active. So this heat map here shows the activity of this neuron on individual trials, with each row being a trial. And you can see the first 30 trials or so, the neuron is active sometimes, and sometimes it isn't active. So the mouse is sometimes getting a reward and sometimes not. But by trial 30, you can see that the neuron is now very reliably activated, with the activation time kind of drifting towards the 0 point, towards the start of the trial. And so within 30 trials, corresponding to about 5 minutes, the mouse has learned to activate this neuron through thinking about something or doing some micro movement or thinking about a movement. Who knows what's happening, but somehow the mouse is accomplishing this task. And it's really fun to watch because they reliably do this very quickly, even from a naive state. The first time you've ever put the mouse under a microscope, they'll happily do this task once you show them that there's water in that lake port, which is, it's really awesome, especially if you spent time training complicated tasks in mice. And so this activity has more than doubled over the course of about 5 minutes, and correspondingly there's an increase in the hit rate. Recall that there's 10 seconds that the mouse has to achieve reward, and so we see in the first 10 trials that the mouse is performing at about 55%, but again within 5 minutes or so that goes up to about 75%. And this time course is very consistent across mice and across experiments, and so from that we conclude that the learning is fast. But so far, all I've told you about is what's happening in the condition neuron. But of course, we're monitoring the activity of the entire population, or at least a large fraction of neurons in the motor cortex. So what's happening in those neurons? We're putting no requirement on what they're doing. And it turns out the condition neuron's far from unique in its tuning to the task. Here's the population of neurons that we recorded in this field of view. There's many neurons that are responding to trial start, some with inhibitory responses, some with excitatory responses. And so these neurons, for whatever reason, are already responsive to the task. But there's many neurons that are not responsive, and that's kind of the population that we select to train the task on, right? These are the neurons that aren't responsive to the task. Let's train the mouse and see if they become responsive. And so that's what happened in our conditioned neuron, right? It increased its tuning. We can just take the activity on multiple days, so we're coming back to the same population, and we see that the tuning is very consistent across neurons across days, right? Neurons that were excited on day 1 are still excited on day 2. So if we plot that against each other, day 1 tuning versus day 2 tuning, it's reliably correlated for most neurons. The conditioned neuron, by construction, was untuned on day 1. That's the one we picked, but it's now drastically increased its tuning on day 2, whereas most other neurons are pretty unchanged. And so the tuning changes here are very sparse. We can visualize that kind of anatomically here and more dynamically. So here we're plotting different trial numbers and we're color coding neurons based on how much they're changing their tuning. And so you see a big increase in the tuning of the conditioned neuron, but not a lot of other neurons changing. There's some sparse subpopulation of neurons. We call these the enhanced neurons, corresponding to about 5 to sometimes 10% of the population of neurons. And so somehow there is very sparse learning happening over the course of 5 minutes or so. And so any learning rule that's happening in the brain has to account for these two features. So we can quantify this tuning change just by comparing the activity on day 1 to the activity on day 2, right? These are the same neurons we're recording. So day 1, this neuron was not controlling the task. Day 2 it was, and there's a corresponding increase in its tuning. We can then calculate that change in tuning for all the neurons in the population, and we see pretty reliably that the conditioned neuron is among the neurons that increase its tuning the most. That's kind of characterized in this histogram here, showing the percentile of the conditioned neuron. In this case, it's probably the 100th or 99th percentile of delta tuning neurons. It's reliably in the 95th to 98th percentile. And there's always this subset of other enhanced neurons. So then we can ask, well, who are these other enhanced neurons? And your first guess might be, well, they might be the ones that are correlated with the conditioned neuron, and indeed that's what we find on average, which is plotted here, where we have delta tuning against correlation with conditioned neuron. And if you think about it, this is maybe consistent with a sort of reward-gated Hebbian learning rule, where these are the neurons that are correlated both to the conditioned neuron, but also therefore to reward. And so if you have a model where neurons or synapses are strengthened when two neurons are coactive in the presence of reward, then that's exactly what you would find when we kind of implement this simple sort of 3-factor learning rule. We get this same kind of relationship. And so this is our first bit of evidence that there's some 3-factor learning. The next part of the talk will go in and look at the connectivity and see if there's something three-factor like in the connection changes. But just to summarize this first part, the learning's fast, the learning is sparse, and the underlying population activity is very stable. And so again, any learning rule has to account for this like very precise flexibility, but also stability, right? The mouse, every time it's learning a new condition neuron, isn't just overwriting everything that it already knew, right? The underlying activity is very stable. Okay, so for the next part, let's map the connectivity and see, are there some changes that are consistent with a three-factor learning rule or some other model? This is what the photostimulation experiment looks like. I've borrowed the video from my colleague Arseny Finkelstein, who's in the Svoboda lab with me back at Janelia. And we did this experiment where we tried to map things as comprehensively as possible. Here we were stimulating single neurons one at a time in rapid succession. And so every time you stimulate one cell and you're imaging 2,000 others, you're basically getting a full column of your connectivity matrix, right? You're seeing how much is that neuron influencing everyone else. And if you have the mouse sit there for 30 minutes to an hour, you can build up this kind of very detailed statistical picture of how the neurons are causally connected to each other. Here we're representing statistically significant connections with these lines. The color denotes the strength of the connection, which is just how much is that non-stimulated neuron responding, like what is the amplitude of that response. And the size of the circle is just the number of significant connections coming out from those neurons. And so in this paper, which is on bioRxiv, we show that there's kind of a sizable fraction of hub neurons, right, these big circles here. And so all of this was done basically at post-training, like after the mouse has already done some behavioral task. And it's interesting to look at the connectivity by itself, but we wanted to combine this with our BCI task and start to look at changes in connectivity. And so this is the timeline of our current experiment, where we're training the BCI task, and when the mouse is done, it's done getting water, it gives up. We then have it sit there for an additional 30 minutes where we do this connection mapping and build up this detailed picture. And then the next day we come back to the same field of view, the same group of neurons, train the task again, and then do the connection mapping again. But in this instance, we pick a different condition neuron. And so now the mouse has to generate a new pattern of activity. And then we can check, is there some change in connectivity that correlates or corresponds to those changes in activity? If you look at these pictures, they look different, but whatever, what does that mean to you? We need to figure out how are we going to analyze this and make sense of it, right? But now we do have some estimate of delta Wij, which is like a lot of work and exciting by itself. So how do we probe for three-factor learning? Well, what is three-factor, right? We have our three factors, our presynaptic activity, that's neuron J, postsynaptic, neuron I, and then our reward. In this case, we're modeling this as a reward prediction error. The simplest type of reward prediction error, it's the current reward. That's basically like the position of the lick port, as compared with a running history of the reward, like averaged over some time window in the past, in the recent past. So those are our three factors. Now, if we want to analyze our data, we can just plot this delta Wij versus, say, the correlation between neuron I and neuron J. And if our RPE is positive, we should expect to see this kind of Hebbian-like learning, right? We call this a positive Hebbian index, where the connections are strengthening between correlated neurons, right? That's like Hebb's principle, right? Neurons that fire together wire together, and that's what we would see if the RPE was positive. We'd see the opposite instead if the RPE was negative, right? If this thing's negative, you would get a weakening of connections between correlated neurons and maybe a strengthening of connections between uncorrelated neurons. And so if you think about that intuitively, it makes sense, right? If this RPE is negative, that means things are going poorly and you shouldn't strengthen the existing connections because that'll just make things worse. Whereas if your RPE is positive, that means you're sort of doing well. You should just start to do that even more frequently and more strongly. And so that's how you would get this kind of behavior. Now, I introduced these because we see both in our data. In some experiments, when we look at the change in connection versus the correlation between neurons, we see this Hebbian-like learning, at least to first order. There's a lot of other interesting structure in this connectivity that we haven't really dug into yet, so we'll put a pin in that. But in this experiment, on average, neurons that were correlated to each other strengthened their connections. And this is a very compact plot, but there's a lot of data in each of these bins. Each of these points is about 1,000 data points. And so there's pretty widespread changes in the connectivity in this circuit, and there is some structure to these changes. And we contrast that with this experiment, just another experiment from I think the same mouse, or at least the same data set, where we see the opposite trend, right? There's a weakening of connections between correlated neurons and a strengthening of connections between anti-correlated neurons. And so we say this one has a negative Hebbian index. And so this tells us that, well, two factors can't explain our learning rule, right? It's not purely Hebbian, which kind of makes sense, right? We wouldn't want purely Hebbian learning. There's no sense of reward in that kind of learning rule. But does that have anything to do, does that third or fourth factor have anything to do with reward is kind of the outstanding question here. Here I'm just emphasizing the diversity of our experiments, right? All the experiments sort of look different with negative Hebbian indices, positive Hebbian indices, and sort of in between in some instances. What we find is that indeed something about the reward does explain the Hebbian index. So let's first focus on this experiment where the Hebbian index was negative. It turns out that in that case we happened to pick a conditioned neuron that was initially negatively tuned to the task. The negative tuning is slight, but it's there. And so if you imagine from the mouse's perspective, it had been controlling the BCI with some other neuron on the previous day. Now we've picked this neuron, which is basically doing the opposite of what it should be doing. And so if the mouse does the exact same activation that it was doing the previous day, it's going to inhibit this neuron and get very little movement of the lick port, thus a negative RPE. And so our expectation is that negatively tuned neurons should give negative RPEs and therefore negative Hebbian indices. Whereas this neuron, which had a positive tuning on the previous day, therefore it was already slightly doing what it should have been doing, that case we could get a positive RPE, and indeed we do see a positive Hebbian index in that experiment. And so if we just look at all of our experiments and compare the tuning on the previous day, that's the day when the neuron wasn't the conditioned neuron, to this Hebbian index, we find that there's a pretty strong correlation between these, where the conditioned neuron tuning is the x-axis, the Hebbian index is the y-axis, and basically all except this interesting outlier, which has its own kind of idiosyncratic features, fall along this line, such that neurons that were already good at the task are generating positive Hebbian indices, and neurons that were kind of bad at the task are generating this negative Hebbian index. And so this is kind of consistent with the kind of hand-wavy picture that I presented to you already, but we can try to test this more rigorously in a very simple model, where we're now implementing this three-factor rule. So this is our learning rule. We can make the important substitution that reward is just governed by the activity of the conditioned neuron, right? Every time the conditioned neuron's active, the lick port moves, and we think of that as the reward. And so we train our network with this rule, and it totally reproduces the results from the experiment, where if the conditioned neuron that we pick is negatively tuned, we get a negative Hebbian index. And if it's positively tuned, we get a positive Hebbian index. And we get a similar scatter plot. So, okay, that tells us how the global activity changes and global connectivity changes, and that it's consistent with our three-factor rule. In the last part, we want to look for more specific changes that are related to changes that are kind of driving improvements in the task. And so recall that there's this sparse subpopulation of neurons that increase their tuning to the task. We can ask, are those neurons connected to each other? And it turns out, well, after training, they are. So how do we check that? Well, we look at when we stimulate one of these orange neurons, what happens to the non-stimulated orange neuron? And after training, there's this excitatory connection between them. That's this magenta line here. But we can ask, were they already connected on the previous day, right? We've done this mapping of the connectivity before they became orange neurons, before they learned anything. And we find that, if anything, they were slightly inhibitory in their connection to each other. And so we can see now that there is this increase in connection strength between these neurons that increase their tuning to the task. And to check if there's any specificity in these changes, we can ask, well, what happens when we stimulate one of these gray neurons? These are the neurons that are not changing their tuning to the task. And we find, on average, they were not connected to this population on day 1, nor are they connected on day 2. And so there is some specificity to this plasticity that we're seeing. We can analyze that in a little more detail here in this scatter plot, where the x-axis is the change in tuning of the stimulated population, so that's the presynaptic neurons, and the y-axis is the change in connection onto the enhanced neurons, so that's the postsynaptic population. And so this point up here is just reproducing what we showed before, the strengthening of connections between these enhanced neurons, and these points down here show that the other neurons are not really changing their inputs. And so this is largely consistent, we think, with a three-factor rule. We can check that in our model. We see kind of it reproduces this result. And so for the most part, this three-factor learning model can explain most of our data, right? It explains the changes in activity that we see in the first part. It explains the changes in connectivity. And so we're really excited about that, right? That we have this system now where we can really study what are the mechanisms underlying plasticity, and dig into these learning rules in a bit more detail. All we've really looked at here is just comparing to basically the simplest model. Now we can ask, are there other models? For example, for these remaining questions, are changes in connectivity consistent with backprop? As I mentioned, we've only compared it to the three-factor rule, but is there some variant of backprop that also explains these results? Preliminary results suggest that, yeah, backprop can explain most of this as well. And so the next challenge is developing new analyses or refining our experiments to kind of tease these two apart. And we have some ideas on this. Happy to talk about if anyone's interested. And also happy to hear ideas if anyone has like a killer experiment that can distinguish these. Like, we would really like to see, is there something like backprop happening in the brain? Two other points. One is, what is the functional form of the RPE? Right now we've just written down this very simple thing. It's reward minus average reward, but there may be something more sophisticated happening, and so we're really interested in seeing that, right? We have a ton of data. We can start to fit different models to the data and see what does that look like. And lastly, how is that reward conveyed to the cortex, right? What are the neuromodulators? And this is where we really take advantage of the strengths of the Allen Institute, looking at different cell types and indicators and so on. Is there dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, or serotonin? Like, we can look at all of these things. Now, naively, we might expect dopamine. This is kind of the classic RPE picture, but it turns out there's very little dopamine projected into the motor cortex. Instead, there is a lot of norepinephrine, and there are some studies from our colleagues at the Allen Institute, Jeremiah Cohen and others, showing that norepinephrine actually in the bandit task that Laura talked about does encode for RPE. And so now we're starting in our task to image norepinephrine inputs from the locus ceruleus in motor cortex, looking for RPE-like signaling. And ultimately, we want to try to block that and see if we block learning. So exciting times. We're trying to dissect learning and refine our understanding of learning in the brain. So again, I want to thank all of my collaborators, and especially Martin Roja, who worked on the experiments with me, and then Matthew Bull and Kyle Aiken, who have done a ton of modeling work. They're both postdocs at the Allen Institute, and I didn't get a chance to talk much about their work, but they've done a ton on helping us understand these data better. So thanks a lot.
Thanks for the great talk. We have time for at least a couple questions.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Really nice.
Oh, thanks.
So I have a question about the assumption that the weights should be static across the test period. And presumably, you don't know exactly what neurons are conditioning the animal.
Yep.
And one question I have is there extinction learning going on during that period? If you're activating neurons within that network, are you getting extinction? And so now you might have two different types of learning that have occurred on the first day that you're then coming back and looking at these changes in weights on the second day. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And then I guess the other question is, you can look at the animal and see conditioned responses potentially to see if there might be some conditioned responses evoked as you're stimulating during the test.
I see. Yeah, so for that point, like some movement evoked by the stimulation or something like that.
Yes.
So there's very little happening. The mouse is very calm once it's gotten all its water, and it's basically like just kind of sitting there. There might be some subtle movements, but yeah, nothing obvious. I didn't quite understand the first question. Like, are you suggesting that there could be some plasticity happening during the stimulation period, or?
Yeah. So basically, if you're putting this in terms of prediction errors, then you could be partially activating the network that is that is leading to the prediction, right? And if that's the case, you're not rewarding them during that time. So there could be some extinction learning, some changes in weights through this test period of testing the connectivity.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, I guess ideally we would be kind of between every trial mapping some subset of the connections, and that's something we'd like to try. We were trying to be very conservative here, where we would just put the mouse in the calmest state it could be in and map in exactly the same state across the 2 days and hope that we could see some changes, but the changes might be much bigger if we looked kind of more intelligently.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering, you could potentially even model it, assuming I was thinking maybe you could use the behavior as some kind of output.
Oh, I see.
As to give a sense of the type of learning that's happening during that period. But
yeah, that's a really good idea. Yeah, thanks a lot.
We'll do one more quick one while the next speaker sets up.
Cool. No, super cool stuff. I guess a bit of a related question. Like, you sort of showed that the mice are actually quite quick in picking up the task, like in the first trial already. And then you also show like synaptic changes in between like different days and so on. Like, what are your thoughts on how this fast learning is happening? Do you think it's more a short-term plasticity thing, or is it more like the sort of mice is modulating its neural activity with the global workspace, or these like more activity-driven?
Yeah, so actually we're writing this up now in a paper, and one of the models developed by Matt Bull here is exactly that. Like, if all of the changes are induced by changing inputs to the circuit, say from thalamus, and without plasticity in the local circuit, how much of these results can you explain? And it turns out you have a very hard time explaining the changes that you see from the photostimulation. You don't see those specific changes.
And like the changes from a photosimulation, is that really like within a single day, or is it across different days?
Well, that's within a single day, but the change that we're seeing is those measurements are done immediately after the mouse is done on that day. And so if the activity changes are driven by just different inputs to the network, then we shouldn't expect to see anything like after the mouse is done, right? Whatever change in those like causal connections has happened during the behavior has persisted at least for 20 minutes after. So now we're trying to mess with like plasticity, like knock out CAMK2 and see do you not see these changes anymore? And it's a complicated experiment, so I don't know the answer yet.
Cool.
But yeah.
Thanks.
I think the speaker again.
Yeah.